So it's my pleasure to introduce to you to moderate the panel on opportunities in tourism, payments, and banking, retail banking in Cuba. And before I invite the three panelists onto the stage, we would like to show you a video to get you in the mood of visiting Cuba.
Vaya esa tiene fortuna que tiene ese animalito que ni el jeje ni el loquito.
So we will tell you a little bit more about this video in a second, but let me invite the three panelists onto the stage. Frank Del Rio, whom you know already, Eddie Lubbers, and Serge Elkiner. Please welcome them. So you can tell who is the cruise ship executive on the panel because he's got a tan, unlike our other two panelists who are hardworking entrepreneurs. And the panel, as I told you a second ago, is about tourism, payments, and retail banking. And those topics actually come together because it is impossible to think about Cuba becoming a major tourism destination without having an infrastructure for payments and for moving money around. And Frank Del Rio, you already know him. He's our first panelist. He's the president and CEO of the Norwegian cruise line. And he's also an entrepreneur because he founded back in 2002, a little bit more than a decade ago, Oceania Cruises, right? And I guess the first question, and I'm trying hard here not to overlap with the comments that you've already made earlier on the program. How do you see the rise of Cuba as a major destination changing the cruise line business in the Caribbean region, or perhaps even globally? I mean, how is this going to make an impact on your business, right?
I think once Cuba opens up, it gives all of the Caribbean cruising in general a boost in the arm. There will be more ships deployed to the Caribbean. There will be more people going to the Caribbean. I think, the good things about ships is they have rudders and propellers. And we can move those assets to wherever they make the most money. And so we think, at least I think, that once Cuba opens up, the pent-up demand, for all the reasons I stated earlier today, are going to be such that we're going to be able to charge more money for our cruises that include Cuba than cruises that don't include Cuba. Whether those cruises are European cruises or cruise ships that otherwise would have gone to Alaska or would have gone to other Caribbean destinations. At least for the foreseeable future, after it opens, Cuba will demand a premium price. And so, business chases the money. That's where the money's going to go.
Okay, and as you know, there are some concerns in other islands in the Caribbean, like the Dominican Republic, Puerto Rico, Jamaica, even Mexico, right, with the Riviera, the Yucatan, that maybe with Cuba becoming a more important tourist destination, perhaps also for cruise ships, this may have a negative impact on them. I mean, what's your view on this? I mean, is Cuba going to essentially steal away business from those other Caribbean destinations, or is it going to add value to the overall supply of options?
I think that Cuba is going to increase the visibility of the Caribbean basin, and I think in general the Caribbean basin will gain from Cuba's opening. Will there be individual destinations within this broad definition of Caribbean basin that may lose business to Cuba? It's possible, at least in the short term, as supply and demand calibrates, as people try the new destination. But I think over the long term, we've seen throughout the short history of the cruise business, that once a destination opens, it brings more interest, more marketing, more ships. Look what happened to China. 5 years ago, 6 years ago, there was no such thing as a cruise industry to China. Last year, 700,000 Chinese got on ships earmarked for the Chinese business. It's estimated that in 2+ years, that number will rise to 1.5 million. That doesn't mean that Japan lost business or that Thailand lost business. All of Asia grew. And as a destination grows, we in the cruise business build more ships to bring more guests. So I don't think that Mexico or the Bahamas or Jamaica need to worry about Cuba. They should encourage those who are in a position to open up Cuba to do so. Because I think, as we say in the cruise industry, a high tide lifts all boats. I think that's what's going to happen here.
Okay, excellent metaphor there. And one last question for you before we move on. How exactly do you think Cuba is going to benefit, specifically in your line of business, right? Cruise lines from the likely increase in activity. So you alluded earlier this morning to perhaps jobs, perhaps investments in infrastructure, perhaps technology transfer. I mean, how do you see Cuba benefiting from this coming boom?
It's industry. The customer that goes on a cruise is an above average customer in terms of economic ability to spend. And so they will go to Cuba and they will spend money in Cuba. Then they will buy more than just rum and cigars. They'll buy art, they'll buy crafts. They'll want to visit all the different destinations in Cuba. Cuba, the wonderful thing about Cuba, it's more than just Havana. There's all these wonderful ports throughout the island, in the southern coast, in the northern area. And so there's going to be a wonderful increase in industry in whatever ports that the cruise lines go to. We're going to need bus drivers. We're going to need guides. We're going to need people to work in restaurants because although there is food on board the ship, they're going to be on tour. They're going to buy things. And that increases commerce. And those folks will be wealthier and more well-to-do. And they, in turn, it's basic economics 101. And I think that these guests will bring dollars, significant dollars. And Cuba will be the better for it.
Excellent, excellent. The one last question, actually, which is kind of a follow-up. Which would be your dream itinerary?
I'm not going to tell you.
Involving Cuba. So I'd like to know, because I know companies in your industry offer many different kinds of options. But from your point of view, which would be the, once you incorporate Cuban, ports of call, which would be the ideal itinerary, let's say, for a 7-day cruise?
It starts in Miami and ends in Miami. And I'll leave you to imagine the other 6 ports.
Okay. Thank you very much. I will come back to you, okay, with another question. Our second panelist is Eddie Lubbers. He's the founder and CEO of the Cuba Travel Network. He is Dutch originally. And he founded this company in Havana in 2002. So here we have, sitting right next to me, somebody who has been an entrepreneur in Cuba for more than a decade. And he's basically operating in the online, part of the economy, digital. So first of all, could you explain to us the video, because it was produced by your company, right, or in association with your company. So what did we see in the video?
Okay, so this is the definitely different tour 2013, which was last year, or the year before actually, when we did a 5-month tour across the island to create visual imagery, proprietary visual imagery of all the destinations and hotels and products that we think is suitable for the individual traveler, so not the group traveler. The video was made by Claudio Pairo, who's an award-winning director in Havana. He works now with December Bueno, for example. And Claudio, working for his own account, went across the island, whilst on the other hand, people from my team were dealing with Mintour to get the appropriate licenses. You saw Claudio jumping from an airplane. That's not an easy thing to do. Claudio was on a boat filming marinas. That's not an easy thing to do. But anyway, that's our teaser video.
Okay, excellent. Yeah. Excellent. As I mentioned earlier, you've been an entrepreneur in Cuba for a long time. And there are all of these, American entrepreneurs or would-be entrepreneurs who would like to, participate in the future in the Cuban economy. So, what advice do you have for them? And if you could perhaps give us a couple of do's and a couple of don'ts, right? So, things that you absolutely believe that every entrepreneur who wants to be successful in Cuba needs to keep in mind, and a couple of things that they should absolutely not do,
okay,
in order to be successful.
Sure. There's lots of both. But to begin with, I should recognize the fact that I'm extremely fortunate to have been born in Holland. I've been born in a country that has allowed me to start a business from the spare bedroom in my mom's house.
Everybody likes people from Holland, except when it comes to soccer.
Right. Exactly, but I can't...
I'm from Spain, that's why I
okay,
mentioned
exactly.
Anyway.
I think we won last night.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah, we did.
That's why I'm raising it.
Revenge. But so I appreciate that. Neither on the Cuban side nor on the American side have I been limited. Had I been an American citizen, I wouldn't have been able to sit there. Had I been a Cuban citizen, neither. So I recognize that. Okay, so business in Cuba, the way I started out 12, 13 years ago, was just to have, I don't know where it came from, but a desire to develop a business in a market that I thought had vast opportunities, the way that it still offers today. And what I would recommend to anybody is to, first of all, become familiar with the regulatory framework, of course. Our business is set up as a sucursal, which means that we're not a joint venture, we're not even represented by a third, by a receptivo cubano. We're as close as you can get to a foreign operating company in Cuba, with all the benefits of having imports directly, being able to contract personnel as directly as you can. But becoming familiar with the framework, the legal framework, the culture, of course. Coming from Holland, I wasn't familiar. I came with a jacket, and the second day I was there, I knew that it's not exactly shorts, but it's an informal economy, at least in Cuba, in terms of culture and the business culture. Finding the right people has been absolutely crucial. I am the owner and founder of this business, but I have many co-founders in my colleagues who've been with me for the past 12 years. And so that's an absolute do. Do find the right people, whether they're former government officials, whether they're cuenta propistas, I don't know. But that's absolutely important. What you shouldn't do is like the compliance officers have been stressing on their corporate levels, but I can affirm on my small business level is, there's a framework that's been established, both in Cuba, in the US, internationally, and you can't violate that ever. And so that's a challenge, because sometimes you're pushed towards limits in Cuba and abroad. But anyway, that would be a big no.
Okay, yeah. Excellent. And do you see Cuban-based entrepreneurs eventually playing a big role with their own companies in the tourism sector, or do you mostly see foreign players in Cuba?
Well, if we limit it to tourism, If you look at recent developments, the past 2-3 years, the Paladares, which have become the leading examples of homegrown businesses, I think they are the best example of that. There may be some capital involved, but in terms of know-how and reference, I think homegrown Cuban businesses in tourism will be there for sure. And actually, throughout the day and also yesterday at our pre-event dinner, there was a lot of focus on the cuenta propista sector, the entrepreneur sector. But I also think eventually Cuban state-owned companies, or that are state-owned today, as per this process of the Ministry of Tourism to limited to tourism, as they assume more of a ministerial role and less of an operational role, I think there's a need for entrepreneurs in state-owned companies. And that may sound like a contradiction today, but eventually, I don't know, guys like Marriott will need a counterpart on a corporate level and not on a cuenta propista level. And so I think for sure the big companies in tourism today have the potential at least to become players in the future, whether it's because it's been completely decentralized or because they have partially foreign capital or so yeah, absolutely. I think on the small business side and also on the Cuban corporate side, there has to be a presence of Cuban companies for sure.
Okay, excellent. This is fascinating. Our third panelist is Serge Elkiner, who is the co-founder and CEO of YellowPepper. And this is a company that is active in the mobile banking and payments space, not just in Cuba, but in other Latin American countries as well. So could you let us know exactly what kind of a role do you play in the movement of money right now in Latin America more broadly, but more specifically in Cuba? I mean, what does your company exactly do?
So we're not present in Cuba.
Not yet.
At this point, right? So we're exploring, like a lot of people, how we can enter, because with technology we can leapfrog a lot of the infrastructure that does not exist today in Cuba, but that could be much more modern than legacy infrastructure that exists in other countries. So we're present today in Latin America in general. We're in 6 countries: Mexico, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Bolivia, and Guatemala. We don't move money internationally. So what we do is really use the mobile to either transact with your bank, so you can check your balance, pay your bills, move money between your accounts, but locally, no remittances yet. And we're also, we've been doing that for 8 years, so we have 56 banks that use our platform and generate about 35 million transactions every month. About 5 million people use our platform today, so it's quite a reach yet for the region, and or already for the region. And then 3 years ago, we decided that the mobile was also an excellent tool to start conducting commerce transaction, whether it's in physical merchant or whether it's on e-commerce, which is booming in the region. And I suspect that Cuba e-commerce will become one of the first platforms to actually grow, because it's a lot faster to deploy an e-commerce merchant than to deploy physical merchant on a scale, right? So the mobile allows us to have a much more secure transaction than what you use today as plastic, right? Because it's much more prone to theft, and we can, what it's called today, tokenize the transaction, so you don't have to give your card information. And that's why we strongly believe that economies like Cuba, which have been lagging in the last 30, 40 years, can benefit from technology to really leapfrog all the way to the forefront of technology to build the system that's going to be now an open system. In 2010, in the Caribbean again, January of 2010, there was a big earthquake in Haiti. The entire system of Haiti collapsed, the financial system. The only system that was up throughout the entire earthquake was the mobile network operator, Digicel and Voila. And 2 weeks later, I went personally to Haiti, and within 6 months, we set up an entire mobile money system in the country, and within 12 months, we had 4 times more branches for the mobile money system than they had ever had branches for banks, all 19 banks together. So I think that technology can play a huge role in banking in Cuba, and we're looking forward to see if we can be part of that.
Okay, excellent. And do you see the tourism industry as a major attraction for you when you're considering entering the Cuban market? So in anticipation of the growth in tourism towards Cuba, is that something that encourages you to set up shop in Cuba, or this is irrespective of the potential growth of tourism on the island?
It plays a role, but it's not the reason for, right? And when I say it plays a role is we pride ourselves of being regional. Regionality allows us to create a system that you can use in Mexico, but in Colombia, but in Ecuador, as you travel through the region. So that, of course, helps in terms of tourism. And if you can tell a tourist that his transactions are secure, that he's not going to be stolen, whether it's cash that is very easily stolen in any country, right? I mean, you can be pickpocket in London, right? I mean, it's not because it's Cuba or others. Or that his cards can be cloned, which I'm sure it happened to pretty much all of us here, where once in our lifetime we had to replace the card because it was corrupted. So if you can give a system like that that's much more secure to tourists, they will feel much better about using it during their travel. So yes, it's definitely a vertical that is helpful to the system.
Okay. And then one last question before we go to the audience for the Q&A segment. And we actually didn't talk about this question in advance, so I apologize, okay? Yeah. But it just occurred to me, dawned on me, that it's very important to, somebody like yourself or your company, when thinking about the Cuban market, the fact that there's something very peculiar about the payment system right now over there, which is that they have a dual currency system. So they have a convertible peso and they have one that is not convertible, right? So from your point of view, is this an obstacle? Is this an opportunity? Are you expecting the government to, at some point, unify the two currencies? What are your views on this?
So we have to see how this is going to evolve, right? It's definitely not an obstacle. I mean, Bolivia has as well dual currency. You have dual currency ATMs in Bolivia. You have a dollarized country like Ecuador. You have like different type of currency system. You now have Bitcoin, of course, that's going to play a role in our global economy at a certain point. So I don't think it's a problem. We just have to adapt to whatever the local flavors will be.
Okay, excellent. So let's turn to the audience. We have about maybe 10 minutes left or so. And once again, identify yourself and ask a question as opposed to make a comment. Maybe let's go first to the first row and then to the person next to the column. Thank you.
My name's Beata, and I actually had a question for Eddie, and that is, where do you see what does the Cuban government want, and how do they see tourism as part of this normalization of relations between the United States and Cuba? And maybe what kind of advice would you give Frank in terms of lessons learned?
Okay, well, actually, to start off with that, I think in the region, cruises are the best possible commercial you can have as an island for people to come and visit you for 24 hours, 48 hours, and then hopefully return as an actual on-land traveler. And so obviously the potential for cruising is huge. And from a Cuba perspective, whereas Fidel, I understand, 5-6 years ago wasn't the hardest strongest proponent of cruise tourism, I think it's turned around a bit. And I think on the Cuban side, they appreciate the business in itself and this collateral function of promoting the destination. And where tourism is seen to go, I'm not too sure. All I can say is, having operated in Cuba, in a country where basically there's the domination of Canadian tour operators on the one side, the Spanish operators on the other side, and the Cuban state in the middle, that has created over the past 20 years a model of all-inclusive tourism, which which is interesting. But for example, for the US market, I think that's not where the opportunity lies. I think Cuba, more than any country in the region, is suitable for individual travel. It's a long island. It's the place. It's a safe island. It's a place you can go and rent a car and have a road trip. And so hopefully that's where at Ministry of Tourism level they see things going. You see some development in Old Havana towards product that's suitable for the individual traveler, and obviously all the product that is emerging from the private sector is very much suitable for the individual traveler. So I hope that that's where things are going, an island that's suitable for short breaks from the East Coast US and for people doing 2 or 3 week itineraries with their families across the island. Yeah.
Please.
Clarence Mitchell from Tropics Holding, and my question is for Eddie as well, not to leave anyone else out. You mentioned the flexibility you had by being from Holland to start a business in Cuba. And I'm wondering if the U.S. embargo placed any constraints on your ability to do business there. Conversely, does the current opening and the openings that we anticipate to occur create any additional opportunities or loosen anything up for you as someone doing business from Holland?
Yeah, well, good question, because there is actually this concept of extraterritoriality. We are a Curaçao-registered business, which has, in fact, its main base of operation in Cuba. And as a result, up until January, we never sold any of our services in US dollars, for example. That's been off limits, even though if we would do that, we know that in Latin American countries and lots of countries, dollar would be the currency of choice. And so that we have added the dollar as a transaction currency since January 16th. And we saw not only from the US an increase in business, but also from lots of other markets. And in general, yes, we've seen a huge uptake in business from the US as well.
Okay, one more question.
A question primarily to Frank, Teo Baboon with Hurstville, Cuba. There seems to be a perfect storm developing.
We don't like storms.
Yeah, that's right. 12 categories of general licenses for American travelers probably means about 300,000 new travelers this year to Cuba. There's a huge capacity problem of hotels in Havana. I think most of you guys, if you're trying to make hotel reservations in Havana, you know that you can't get it, or you can hardly get it. So the question is, what are we looking at in terms of the number of potential travelers that we're about to see, the lack of hotel rooms vis-a-vis the possibility of cruise lines or fast ferries or hotel ferries or whatever into Cuba? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I don't know about ferries. I don't know about the land program. They're our natural enemies, so to speak. But look, in 2015, 24 million people will cruise around the world. Roughly 9 million will go to the Caribbean. And if we believe that Cuba will become the center of Caribbean cruising, an overwhelming majority of those 9 million, if it doesn't grow past the current size, will be going to Cuba. And that's a huge number that no matter how many hotels are built, can't handle 9 million guests above and beyond what they already have. I'm not sure the existing port infrastructures can handle an influx of 9 million folks. It's a lot of ships. It's a lot of big ships. So we're not going to go from 0 to 9 million people overnight. It's going to take time. But I do believe that if the embargo is lifted and we can conduct business in Cuba like we conduct business everywhere else in the world, that, as I said earlier today, Cuba can be certainly a top 10, Havana can be a top 10 destination within a short period of time. Within an intermediate period of time, meaning 5 to 7 years, it could be among the top 5 cruise destinations of the world. It will take longer than that to build anywhere near the number of hotels, because it's not just hotels. Let's start with airports. Today, I'm told there are only 4 baggage carousels at Jose Marti International. You need more runways. You need more, the equivalent of the FAA. You need more hotels, more rental car companies. If you need more rental car companies, you need better roads. So that's where infrastructure constraints start playing a role. The wonderful thing about the cruise industry, again, is we don't need much of that in order to bring tourism to Cuba in the very short term. And so, again, I think the cruise industry can be the trigger, if you will, for expanding tourism to the North American market above and beyond what's already there for the European and the Canadian market.
One last question, Melissa.
Hello, Melissa Blom, Wharton and Lauder alum. This question is for Serge, actually. When it comes to new technologies like mobile banking, which will undoubtedly be a very new experience for Cuba, what kinds of cultural adoption issues might you foresee, and how do you think you might mitigate those?
Actually, I think it's the opposite. So, mobile in general in emerging markets is the #1 point of access to the internet compared to a personal computer, right? It's much cheaper to own a mobile phone than a personal computer, so most of the access to the internet is done through mobile phone versus personal computer. And I think it's going to apply to Cuba as well. If I'm not mistaken, there is a little bit more than 20% of the population that has a mobile phone today. The average in Latin America is 114%, which means more than the population of each country. So there is a huge potential for Cuba and Cubans in general to start growing their telecommunication industry. Same thing in terms of banking. If I'm not mistaken, it's 1 or 2 government-controlled banks. So there is a huge possibility for deregulation there and more banks coming. And the adoption is going to come on its own. The thing on top of that with Cuba is you have like a very literate country, right? So there is no problem of illiteracy and things like that that you can find in other Latin American markets. So you have a full, nearly 100% of the, economically active population that will be able to access a phone and will want to access more information. And therefore, the adoption, I think, will be a lot faster than in other countries, as we have seen so far.
Okay, so we actually are out of time. So please start planning for your Cuba vacation. And you've got to start in Miami. Make sure that you have a plan to return to Miami, okay? So please join me in thanking our 3 panelists.